Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Vicki Auberg here in Seattle, Washington at Seattle Pacific University, sitting with a group of about 30 nursing students. And we're here to talk about consent and information all about consent, consent for sexual activity. I'm going to share my slides. And I have to wait for that to go away. There we go. Okay, so talking about consent then. So what we're going to talk about, I'm going to define consent for you. We're going to talk about the consequences of lack of consent for sexual activity. We're going to look a little bit at what do we know from research literature about consent, about what is taught, about what young people know or don't know. We'll also talk some about issues that are kind of behind consent or lack of consent. And then what can we do as healthcare providers or soon to be healthcare professionals to help make this better for everybody. So just a note here, lack of consent and sexual assault happens or can happen among anybody and everybody. I may refer to the person not having consent for sexual activity as males because that's what we tend to think about in our society, and as the person who's been assaulted as females, as that's often what happens in our society. However, women can be perpetrators of sexual violence. Sexual violence occurs in same-sex partnerships as well as in heterosexual partnerships. I'm just putting that disclaimer out there. Okay, so what consent is. Let's talk a little bit about consent, what that means. So consent is a verbal, voluntary, enthusiastic, affirmative, yes, I would like to do that. Yes, I would love to participate in that. Yes, I would come on in. Yes, I would love to do whatever it is you're referring to. Additionally, consent is asking permission before changing the type or the degree of sexual activity with asking something like, is this okay? Would it be okay if we? Would you like to fill in the blank? Also, consent is made up of confirming that there is actual interest from the other person before taking that step of any kind of physical touch. Additionally, letting your partner know that sexual activity can stop at any time. Just because some sort of sexual activity has been going on does not mean that it must continue. It can stop at any time. Consent additionally is checking in with your partner from time to time. Is this still okay? Are you still liking this? Is it okay if I do more? Those kinds of questions. Also, providing feedback to your partner that's very much welcome. That's very much what I want. Being much more verbal about what is happening than may generally happen. Additionally, using physical cues to let the other person know that you are okay continuing with sexual activity. So let's talk a little bit about what consent is not. So consent is not refusing to acknowledge a no. If one person says, would you like to do this thing? And the other person says no, then that activity must not happen, or there is no consent. Consent is not a partner who is not responding, who is visibly upset, who is not engaged in what is going on. That should be sexual activity that does not happen. Sexual consent is not assuming that wearing certain types of clothes or flirting or kissing is an invitation necessarily to more sexual activity. Those two things do not go together. Consent is not somebody being under the legal age of consent. In the United States, Consent is defined by the state that you live in. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Consent is also not someone being drunk or being high on some sort of substance. Those individuals cannot consent. Consent is also not pressuring somebody into sexual activity by saying something like, well, if you really loved me, you would do this thing. That's coercion. That is not consent. Consent is not assuming that you already have permission to do whatever the sexual act is because you've done that before. Just because someone's participated in an activity before does not give them the right to make that assumption going forward. Consent is also not making assumptions about physiological arousal. It does not imply consent. So if a male has an erection, that does not mean that that male consents to sexual activity. If the female is sexually aroused and has vaginal lubrication, that does not mean that she consents to sexual activity. Okay, questions so far? Anybody? Okay. So who cannot give consent? So people who are under the age of consent. We live in Washington State. The age of consent in Washington is 16 years of age. So 15-year-olds and 14-year-olds technically cannot give consent to sexual activity. Again, somebody under the influence of drugs or alcohol, someone who is sleeping, someone who is unconscious, or someone who is comatose or otherwise cognitively impaired. Again, in the United States, consent is defined by the state. There's a range in the US. Many states are 16 years of age. There are a few states that are 14, some that are a little bit higher age of consent. So I would challenge you to find out what the age is of consent where it is that you live. So legal consequences are a possibility when sexual activity happens without consent. So what do we call that? This terminology that I'm going to describe here is terminology that we use in the United States. It may be a little bit different in where you are, but touching another person in a sexual way without any kind of consent is considered sexual assault in this country. And penetration of another person's vagina or anus or mouth with any object, it could be a penis, a bottle, a gun, it does not make any difference. Those are all considered rape. Here's what we know about sexual assault. These numbers are estimates because many people never make any kind of report to the police or any kind of statistics to have a more accurate count of how often this is happening. But best estimate is that 1 in 5 women will be raped or have an attempted rape in her lifetime. Some of those are in childhood. Some of those are in adolescence or in adulthood. About 25% of men will experience some form of sexual abuse or sexual harassment. Many of these occur in childhood again, or also in adulthood. Generally, with sexual assault that happens in childhood, it's almost exclusively someone that is known to the child. It's a family member, it's a close friend of the family, someone that the child has regular contact with. In adulthood, the majority of abusers of sexual violence are also known to the person who is attacked. The stereotypical idea of someone grabbing a young woman who's walking through a park in the middle of the night, that's a rare exception to sexual assault. It's generally someone who the person knows. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what do we know about the research? What does the research tell us about teaching about consent? In the United States, there are 18 of our 50 states in which there is a mandatory statewide sexuality-based curriculum for kids in K through 12 schools. So K through 12 schools would be 5-year-olds through about 18 before students would go to the university. In only 2 of those 18 states, in Oregon and New Jersey, did the word consent show up as part of the mandatory topics that needed to be taught. So that's only 1 in 25 states in the US where this content needs to be taught. Other states may very well have the topic of consent along with other information that is being taught, but when it's not explicitly stated, whether it's part of the standard curricula, it really leaves room for questioning whether it's actually taught or not. So if something is not explicitly stated, it leaves room for the educator to maybe skip over that particular content. Anybody surprised by that 1 out of 25 states mandate that? Yeah, me as well. Additionally, we know that parents tend to provide very general sexuality education if they provide anything at all. Sometimes the sexuality education consists of only, here's what's happening to your body, here's how your body is changing when puberty is happening, maybe here's how not to get pregnant. But generally, that's about the extent of the content. McDougall surveyed a number of college students about their perceptions about sexual consent in the education that they had had before they came to college. And these students identified 5 different sources of sexuality consent education. And these 5 sources were mom and dad and friends, and then school-based sexuality education and the internet. And these students said that they learned the most from the internet, secondarily, a moderate amount from friends and from school-based education, and a small amount from parents. So it seems that parents are probably not doing much in terms of consent education related to sexuality. Internet has a whole variety of sources, some of which may not be the best quality in terms of consent education. So we know that a lot of people are not getting the information that they need. In a study done just last year of 365 college men, they asked about their beliefs about consent and about sexual assault. And 64% of these men said that they had a really clear understanding of consent and of lack of consent, but that leaves quite a big portion that still don't have much understanding of consent. 59% said that they know when they are taking advantage of another person in a sexual way. And 27% said that they know when sex is not wanted. Again, that leaves about 3/4 that did not have a good understanding of when sex is unwanted. So this supports that that youth tend to be fairly well educated about consent, yet we know that sexual assault and rape still occur among college-age youth on a regular basis. And so there's something that we are missing here in this picture. So let's talk about a theory that is related to this topic. This theory is called sexual scripting theory. And what this means is that there are directions, essentially, that are given to young people about how they should or should not act when it comes to sexual situations. This sexual scripting theory tends to put a lot of pressure on males to decide when to make advances of a sexual nature, how to go about doing it, what to do. It also puts pressure on women to be submissive and wait for the male to initiate these advances. These directions tend to come from different forms of media, from television shows, from movies, from written media, from music videos, and from pornography. This sexual scripting that I've talked about already is very intertwined with gender norms. This idea that the male needs to initiate the first any kind of sexual activity, that the females is expected to be submissive and wait for the male to initiate sexual activity. These are all gender norms that we tend to see played out in movies and TV shows and those sorts of things. We also know that this sexual scripting theory and getting our role modeling from movies and television shows and pornography tends to reinforce sexually violent behavior as the norm. Okay, so that's problematic. So sex tends to be a private experience between two people, right? So as children are growing up and learning how to be functional in society, they look to other people around them to see how to do things. They look at mom and dad for how do you go to the grocery store and buy milk and cheese and vegetables, for example, or what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to behave when I'm at church? Why am I not supposed to run and scream and yell while other people are trying to be quiet? They look to adults for role modeling of how to be in these various settings, how to be a student and sit still and be patient and take turns and raise your hand, right? But because sex is a private experience, then young people, kids, do not have role modeling for what this should look like other than television and movies and pornography and so forth. So the media that is available out there is role modeling for these young people how to function as a sexual being. And most often, these sources of role modeling do not provide good quality consent information or information about a loving, mutually satisfying, pleasurable relationship. So there's a really big missing piece here for kids as they are trying to figure out, how do I function as a sexual adult? Another piece that's part of this sexual scripting is rape myths. And these are beliefs that tend to be floated around, commented on social media and so forth. So some examples of rape myths are that women want to be raped. I personally don't know any woman who wants to be raped. Another rape myth would be that people working in prostitution cannot be raped because this is what they do for a living. That's not the case. That is not the case. Another example is that a husband cannot rape his wife. They are married. He should be entitled to sex anytime he wants it. That's also a myth. Also that women ask to be raped. Also that when a man pays for a date, pays for a dinner, pays for a movie, that she owes him sex. These sorts of myths, again, are very much part of sexual scripting. Again, because this is what we tend to see in movies and TV shows. It also tends to be a pretty common justification for violent sexual behavior. Okay. So in and among rape myths, there's no presence of consent. Additionally, in sexual health textbooks in the United States, generally, these textbooks tend to have good information about physiologic-based sexual health. Here's how the female body works. Here's how the male body works. Here's how this form of birth control works. Here's what you need to know about this STI. Here's how it's treated. Here's how it's cured. That kind of information tends to be pretty good. But very often, there is information that is missing about sexual decision-making. how does a person go about making a good decision about asking for consent and then progressing to sexual activity. Often, excuse me, there will be missing communication skills, practice related to sexual decision making, as well as activities to be able to practice these skills related to sexual decision making. So essentially, we are not setting young people up very well to be able to be functional adults that have practice with these things in classroom settings. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of ways to help improve consent and reduce sexual assault. I'm going to stop sharing this for a moment and share something different. Bear with me just a moment here. So what I have here we go. We're going to watch two video clips from a movie that probably most students here in the room know. This is from the movie Grease from 1978. So we're going to watch both clips and then we'll talk about what you have seen in these video clips. Here we go. Excuse me, just a moment. And you all still can't see it. Okay. All right. Bear with me just a sec. That is still not showing for you. Okay, I am going to describe the video clips for you rather than sharing them with you. The first is the scene from, well, they're both the scenes from Grease, where Danny and Sandy, who are a young couple who are dating, are at the drive-in movie theater and sitting in Danny's car. And Danny takes off his class ring and presents it to Sandy that they are now going steady, if that's okay with her. And she's very excited about this. And she says, "Now I know that you respect me." So immediately following that, Danny does reach out with his arm, puts his arm around her, and then is very slowly trying to move his hand down to be able to touch her breast. At some point, she realizes what is happening and she leaves the car. She gets out of the car and is very upset. And he's upset that she's not allowing him to take this, do this sexual activity. So you all have seen the movie? Yeah, okay, so you know the scene that I'm talking about. So if we look at some of these sexual scripting theory kind of things, so what kind of pieces do you see there, first of all, about consent, having to do with consent? Are there pieces, when you think about that scene, do you see consent in that scene anywhere? Okay. What kind of gender norms did you see being perpetuated, or gender roles being perpetuated? The male was initiating. Yeah, absolutely. How about back here? Giving a gift and expecting something in return. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's a really subtle form of coercion, right? right? What else? What else did you see? That he's expecting her to just go along with it, that this is just what you do, right? Okay, good. What else? No communication. Yeah, good. There wasn't a conversation beforehand that went something like, Sandy, I would really like to do this. Are you into that? Would that be okay? There was no communication like that. I also see her very much falling into the role of having to play the female and having to protect herself and fend off advances, which has been for a long time very kind of traditional gender roles around sexual activity. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so one way of helping improve consent or reducing sexual assault would be to point out to people in a setting like this, a setting working with young people, say as a community health nurse, you might be doing a presentation in an after-school program, and an afternoon presentation could be about sexual consent. Using video clips like this to illustrate your point about what happened and what didn't happen, and challenge these false beliefs is one way to make some progress toward improving consent. Another way to challenge rape myths would be if you hear someone say something like something having to do with rape within a marriage, or someone denying that rape could happen within a marriage, to be able to challenge that. Consent should be about whether sex is good for me right now, and I can say no at any time that I feel like. In addition, in terms of textbooks, I think that there needs to be really specific, really clear classroom-based activities about sexual decision-making. And in addition to practice consent and to practice negotiating some sort of activity, work your way up to negotiating sexual activity. So as an example, let's say that students would pair up and one person would say, hey, here, watch this video on my phone, or I'm going to have a cup of tea. Do you want a cup of tea? And then the other person can practice. It sounds very simplistic, but the other person can practice saying, yes, I would like tea, or no, I would not like to have tea right now. If the person gets a no, I don't want to have tea right now, then it's okay to offer tea again later, right? So step 2 would be then in the classroom to imagine how it would be to make tea anyway, even if the person says no, to hold the person down and force them to drink the tea that they have already said, no, I don't want. And then to have a conversation about that and about how with something really simple and straightforward, like a cup of tea, about how offensive it would feel to have that forced on you. Okay? And then to have a discussion about that. Step 3 then would be to turn the tables, and how would it feel to have the tea forced on yourself? Students could also practice this with other items. Let's say if we're talking about tea, would you like to have sugar in your tea? Would you like to have milk in your tea? How about some cookies with the tea? To have practice with something like that seems so straightforward, but it is a good basis for being able to ask questions, to be able to have the opportunity to practice respecting when someone says no. I think, again, this is so missing in TV shows and movies that we've got to start somewhere. So again, step 4, respect the answer. If you get a no, respect the answer and say, okay, how does it feel then? Have a discussion. How does it feel if the other person says no, to say, okay, I'll put the other tea mug away. Okay. And then lastly, discussion of sexual behavior. So progress it from talking about a cup of tea to talking about sexual behavior. I would really like to hold your hand. Would you like that too? Yes. Okay. Hold hands. No. Okay. Practice respecting that response, and then continue having these discussions. So again, emphasizing this, respecting the answer regardless of the answer, will help build trust in a relationship. In the Netherlands, they have a model of sexual education that begins at about 4 years of age. And I think it's a really lovely model. I wish that the model would be adopted here in the US, but I don't believe that we are ready for that in this country at this point. There is a link to, you can watch some short video clips about what the teachers do in the classroom. But at 4 years of age, they have information they are presented about safe touch, about hugging and kissing, about bodily autonomy. So for example, the teacher might ask, when is it that you want to hug someone? And maybe the little four-year-old kid would say, I would want to hug someone because I love them. I would want to hug my grandma because she makes me cookies. And then to reinforce that if you want to hug someone or kiss someone, that's okay. And conversely, if you do not want to hug someone or kiss someone, that you should not be forced to have to do that. So very much focused on bodily autonomy, the right to say no. Okay. In around the 8-year age in the Netherlands in school, they start talking about gender, image, and gender stereotypes. In around the 11-year age, they start talking about sexual orientation and birth control. This is done in every school in the Netherlands. And interestingly, the Netherlands has very, very low rates of teen pregnancy in comparison to the United States, very low rates of sexually transmitted infections in comparison to the United States. So this program is really aimed at helping students develop these skills to protect against sexual coercion and intimidation and abuse. And I think it's a really lovely model. There are those clips. So ways that parents can help their kids practice bodily autonomy when they are home. If Aunt Susie comes to visit and little Bobby decides he doesn't want to hug Aunt Susie, I think that Bobby should be allowed to have his wishes respected. Bobby should not be forced to give Aunt Susie a hug if Bobby doesn't feel like it. So in early school years, it's really helpful if kids can learn that what they want related to their bodies is acceptable and should be respected. So in summary, things that we can all do to help all of this, and things that you all can do as nurses going forward, is to challenge this sexual scripting that we have talked about, and to challenge rape myths when you hear them. Secondarily, teach young people the skills, and then also have them practice asking for consent and respecting the response, even if it starts with something as simple as watch this video on my phone, or would you like a cup of tea? And then thirdly, start teaching bodily autonomy, and that they have a right to privacy with their bodies when they are young, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old. Okay, are there any questions or comments at this point? Anybody heard of, I'm gonna stop the recording.